Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. The killing of Jordan Neely was as disgusting and vile as it was deliberate and unnecessary. A man who was experiencing a mental health crisis and who had been abandoned by all the relevant agencies of the city had been killed in a manner just like Eric Garner. Mr. Neely was mostly known as being a Michael Jackson impersonator who apparently was quite popular with the locals. His assailant is unnamed. I didn't say unknown, I said unnamed. The white media knows exactly who Jordan Neely's killer is. In fact, they've even talked to him, but they're refusing to publish his name. Except a publication in the UK, the Daily Mail, apparently didn't get the memo before they actually published the guy's name. But I guess somebody told them after the fact, hey, you're not supposed to be putting the guy's name out there. We're trying to keep the public in the dark. So the Daily Mail very quickly erased it, but not before people had already seen it and already spread the word. All we know about him is that he's white, and apparently he allegedly was in the Marine Corps. So since the only thing the police and the white media are saying about the killer is that he was white, that's the only thing we know about him. So this white assailant came up from behind Mr. Neely and put him in a chokehold. Other passengers, at least one of them appearing to be a person of color, held Mr. Neely's arms while the white assailant squeezed harder around Mr. Neely's throat. Mr. Neely was clearly gasping for air. The white assailant still continued to strangle him. Mr. Neely stopped breathing. The white assailant continued to strangle him for minutes on end, even after he was clearly unconscious. Not for seconds, but for minutes on end. Mr. Neely, it needs to be noted, wasn't attacking anyone. What he was doing was he was allegedly yelling that he didn't have any food or anything to drink and doesn't care if he goes to jail or dies, but that's all he was doing. He wasn't attacking anyone, wasn't spitting on anyone, wasn't threatening to hit anyone. By the way, the New York Times belatedly reported that another subway rider who had encountered Mr. Neely a couple of weeks earlier said that he had seemed upset, but she calmed him down when she offered him a few dollars, and she said that he told her thank you for 5 minutes. He thanked her for 5 minutes, simply because she gave him a few dollars. He didn't rob her, he didn't demand more money, he didn't yell or act out, he thanked her. For 5 minutes. He didn't do anything violent to her before she gave him the money or afterwards, which was also the case on the day that he was violently killed. He wasn't assaulting anyone, wasn't threatening anyone, he was yelling. His behavior was unpleasant, but this is New York City. I can show you 100 videos easily of people yelling on the subways. Since when did that become a life and death situation in New York? Well, since somebody thought that they saw an opportunity to kill a black person because of a number of signals they had been getting from Democrats in New York City and in New York State. This white 24-year-old who used to be in the Marines thought he saw an opportunity because rather than let the police handle this, which is their job, by the way, there is a transit police, by the way, in New York. This guy decided he was going to play subway vigilante. Not in self-defense, mind you. He was not attacked, neither was anyone else on the train. Just a matter of this guy's yelling and I'm gonna do something. And I'm sure that he'll try some phony claim of being afraid for his safety or something like that. He'll fly that trial balloon and see if it actually works. The Kyle Rittenhouse defense. Mr. Neely was pronounced dead at the hospital, but it was clear he was already dead on that train. The killer, along with the accomplices, stood over Mr. Neely's dead body, making no effort whatsoever to see if he was alive or to render any sort of medical assistance. This white unnamed assailant did not do anything to summon any sort of medical assistance for this man who he had strangled to death. That's called depraved indifference under the law. But of course, we don't live under a system of laws, we live under white supremacy. And just to make the point, the white authorities view thugs like the one who killed Mr. Neely as being part of the irregular forces of white supremacy, the ununiformed crooks who white supremacy uses to carry out extrajudicial killings of black citizens. The killer has not been arrested. He hasn't even been charged. The police simply decided to let him go. He was given the exact same immunity from the law that police are given when they kill a black person, and this killer doesn't have a badge. He's an unnamed white man who decided to sneak up behind and strangle a black man to death on a train in broad daylight simply because. The medical examiner has ruled this killing a homicide. The killer, as of this briefing, has not been arrested. By the way, can anyone name any circumstance where a black person kills an unarmed white person who has not attacked them, that it's caught on video and the black man's not arrested? John White is a black father in Long Island, New York. You'll recall I told you about how his son had been brutally beaten and attacked at a party by white teenagers. Mr. White's son fled home. The white teenagers who attacked his son got in their car and drove to Mr. White's residence. This in the middle of the night, mind you. And these white teenagers who had already violently assaulted Mr. White's son stood in front of Mr. White's house and demanded that he send his son out. Mr. White instead got his gun and met them at the end of his driveway to protect himself and his family and told them to leave. One of the teens, who was the ringleader of this violent gang and who had beaten Mr. White's son, tried to go for Mr. White's gun, and the gun went off, killing the thug. And while it was unfortunate that a life was lost, keep in mind, they beat this man's son violently, then got in the car to pursue him and drove to Mr. White's house. Is it reasonable for anyone to think that if you attack a person's child and then come to that person's house afterwards and say, I'm going to attack your child again, that maybe somebody in that house might think they were under threat? But of course, the laws of self-defense never seem to apply if it's a black person defending themselves. Mr. White was illegally arrested, charged in direct contravention of his state and federal rights, and wrongfully convicted. That in a case where his child had been brutally beaten, and then the thugs who attacked his son literally came to Mr. White's doorstep like a lynch mob and confronted him in front of his own house. This is the same New York that is now pretending that it can't figure out whether the killing of Mr. Neely is a crime or not. So this isn't about not knowing whether any laws were broken. This is about the fact that laws only apply based on skin color and nothing else. Jordan Neely's killer remains at large. His face has been shown in many places. His military affiliation is known, as is his age, and the white media like the New York Daily News has even called this killer. And yet nobody in the white media, nobody at all, not the New York Times, not the New York Post, not USA Today, nobody has reported his name. Strange, don't you think? I mean, everybody sees his face. Because they report the names of suspects to crimes all the time, but in this case, the entire white media sphere has gotten totally on code across the board, and they have instituted a blanket embargo on naming this killer. Is it perhaps because there's things in his military or civilian record that would incriminate him? We know that when a black person is killed by some white supremacist, the white media is very eager to report on that black person's identity, but only if they can find some priors or something they can use to dirty them up and justify killing them. If they can't find anything to justify killing them, if they can't dirty up the black victim, then they drop the story altogether and walk away. Yet, in this case, they're completely disinterested in this guy who killed a man in cold blood on a subway train for no reason. But now the killer's name has finally been figured out by some concerned citizens, and now people have put the guy's name out there. The only reason that I'm not mentioning is because YouTube loves to try to shut down people's channels and say, you're doxing or doing something. We don't know what, but we'll make up a reason, but we got to shut down your channel. They like doing that mess, so the guy's name is out there, finally, because of concerned citizens. We don't know the killer's criminal record, whether he's part of any white supremacist hate groups. Does he have any priors? Was he dishonorably discharged from the Marines? Does he have a history of violence? I'm willing to put money on it. This guy jumps on an unarmed black person on a train for no reason. So this reminds me of every other white supremacist thug who decide that they're going to attack a black person simply because. The white media, however, they didn't want you to know who the guy is. After all the instances of police killing people with chokeholds, this criminal knew exactly what he was doing. Everyone does. What he was betting on is genetic immunity from law. Now, what are the authorities doing about it? About what you would expect. Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD, who I hear moonlights as the city's mayor, initially defended the killing, as did the Democratic Governor Kathy Hochul.
So we don't have people who are homeless in our subways, many of them in the throes of mental health episodes, and that's what I believe are some of the factors involved here. And there's consequences for behavior, and I look at it more closely to find out whether the state has a role. People who've been out on parole have different consequences, and a judge can make a decision on whether to hold someone, or a DA can make a decision to charge them. But in a case where someone is on parole, then the state has an ability, as we've done before in more serious cases, to ensure that someone is held during pending the outcome of the episode. But no, that was deeply disturbing, and that causes a lot of fear in people. And actually, the mayor and I are working so hard to restore that sense of safety. We have the cameras on the subways. We have more police officers. We're assisting with overtime. We've been doing so much.
Well, with the governor saying that, it's very easy to see why you got all the white media and all the rest of the white authorities on code. Listen to what she says. There's consequences for behavior. This woman gives a full condemnation of the person who was killed. She's not saying a doggone word about the killer. Instead, she goes on this pathetic rant that is basically demonizing the guy who was killed. She's saying things that apparently are about the deceased. Saying, well, people on parole and judges holding people and incarceration. Well, is she going to say anything about the killer? Of course not. They're trying to protect the killer. She said the video was disturbing. And then she went on, well, this is why people are afraid. And she makes it clear she's talking about Mr. Neely. She's not talking about the guy who killed him. She said, well, that's why they have subway cameras and we're putting more police out there. She's demonizing the guy who was killed. This is a Democrat doing this. This isn't a Republican here, this is a Democrat. She doesn't say a word about white vigilantes attacking people as a reason for people to be afraid, and that's deliberate. Kathy Hochul is defending and justifying the killing of Jordan Neely. She's talking about behavior having consequences. Yeah, but apparently not for white vigilantes. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down, or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by. Keep that leaf blower at the ready, and always carry your steel. Power Tools. Because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. Did anyone say that behavior has consequences when John White was forced to use force to defend himself and his family? Instead, all we heard was how the teenage thugs who attacked his son were good kids, well up until the night that they beat Mr. White's son and then followed him home and then threatened Mr. White and his family outside their own house. Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD is saying we need to make sure we stay calm and no rush to judgment and let the investigation play out. We all know what that means. It means let's see if we can wait this out until it fades from the headlines and we'll sweep this one under the rug and then we'll give the killer a wink and a nod and a pat on the back and an attaboy. Meanwhile, Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD says absolutely nothing about Kathy Hochul. And she's saying that Mr. Neely was a criminal and that there's consequences for behavior. Enough talk about, gee, Governor, you shouldn't be rushing to judgment. Let the investigation play out. We don't know what the world happened here. Nobody's reprimanding her at all. So just as with white police officers who kill black people, the only time we ever hear that don't rush to judgment crap is when the assailant's white and the victim is black. We never hear it at any other time. The anonymity that they're trying to extend to this killer is just like what they do for the police when they kill black people, and that's deliberate. It's meant to say clearly to the public, at least the non-black public, go ahead and kill a black person and you'll be essentially deputized by the police and given the same shield of anonymity that the thugs in blue get. The killing of Jordan Neely is exactly like the one I told you about in my crime report from 3 weeks ago, when I told you about that so-called MMA fighter in Florida who killed a black Air Force serviceman with a sucker punch from behind. That was also a case where the killer wasn't being attacked. He had no reason to attack that man. He just thought he saw an opportunity to get away with something. And I'll bet that just about now, a lot of those black voters in New York who let political prostitutes like those bootlicking Negro pastors and political whores talk them into voting for Officer Adams, they're probably starting to have some second thoughts now. Well, for the few of them who actually think. Yeah, a lot of those Negroes who made excuses for buying into Eric Adams' line of crap, they're looking real stupid about now. And one of the people who's probably having buyer's remorse is Al Sharpton. His National Action Network website has a brief, very brief quote from him saying, "The National Action Network demands the district attorney and police investigate this horrific incident as a potential case of manslaughter, if not murder." Yes, he's calling on the police to bring charges. Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD should be very familiar with them. And Sharpton should be familiar with Officer Adams. After all, 2 years ago when Officer Adams was running for office, Al Sharpton's own daughter Ashley endorsed Officer Adams. She even went on to gush that she calls him Uncle Eric. I guess that's because Uncle Tom was already taken. So Eric Adams of the NYPD is a very close friend of the Sharpton family. Now, Al Sharpton tried to maintain some razor-thin pretense that he was staying neutral in the mayoral race, but instead Sharpton's National Action Network held a Get Out the Vote rally in which he invited Officer Adams as well as other mayoral hopefuls to attend and speak. Al Sharpton's daughter didn't endorse the other candidates, but she did endorse Officer Adams by name. So for Sharpton to invite the man who his daughter endorsed to an event and to give the guy a platform, well, we've all known how messy Al Sharpton is for a long time now. Even now, with half the city up in arms, Al Sharpton refuses to call out Uncle Eric. Instead, he brags about how he allegedly spoke out when Bernie Goetz shot and tried to kill 4 black teenagers back in the 80s. But notice that Sharpton doesn't mention how he railed against the mayor of New York at that time, Ed Koch. Oh yeah, he and Sharpton used to be in it all the time, allegedly. But Sharpton's not saying anything about that now, because if he did, then he would have to call out his family friend, Officer Adams. Oh, I'm sorry, I mean Uncle Eric. Sharpton's speaking out of both sides of his mouth, demanding that charges be brought when Officer Adams is saying don't jump to any conclusions. Well, gee, does that go for the coroner too? The guy who ruled this killing as a homicide? Maybe the coroner shouldn't have jumped to any conclusions either, huh? You know you're on the wrong side of an issue when Alexandria Cortez, of all people, who has never spoken up for or stood up for the black community, says that what happened to Mr. Neely was murder. And yet your alleged black mayor of the city is telling everyone just because it's been ruled a homicide, that's no reason for us to treat it as a homicide. That's your lawlessness in New York City. The police allowing thugs to kill people and refusing to bring charges. There's been backlash to Hochul and Adams' defense of the murder of Jordan Neely, and those two worms are now backing down from their earlier defense of the killing, but not by very much. And besides, at this point, they've already made their position crystal clear. Both of them are showing everyone that the racist policies that persecuted black people in New York City and the rest of the state were not simply because of Rudy Giuliani or Michael Bloomberg. It's because there is an open policy of anti-black racism that both Republicans and Democrats are enforcing in that state. Everyone recognizes exactly what this is about. It is about reinforcing and reestablishing the ability of white supremacists to kill black people with impunity. The Ahmaud Arbery trial showed that killing black people was no longer a guaranteed acquittal anymore. And there's clearly a demand on both the left as well as the right that the right of racial immunity from law be reestablished. And the first step to doing that is to have a blatant public display of killing a black person. Then you have the Democratic politicians defend it, and finally the public's told, well, there's nothing that's going to be done about it. That way, every racist who wants to attack a black person will be reassured that the authorities are giving the green light to attack black people anywhere, and all you have to do is say, well, that black person was bothering me. It's not even a matter of being threatened anymore. The unnamed by the white media thug who killed Jordan Neely, he wasn't being attacked. He can't say that he was under threat. He was just trying to do something. That's why you're seeing all these white supremacists who are trying to speak out on this, because this is just like the killing of Trayvon Martin in that everybody understands this was a completely and thoroughly capricious act of killing a black person simply because. And that's the principle that these white supremacists want to reinforce, and you got Eric Adams trying to help them do it. But for the black people in New York who thought that it was cute to vote for this guy 2 years ago, this is what you voted for. I made a number of videos and online postings telling you exactly what kind of creep Officer Adams is and how he's a black puppet whose entire purpose is to carry out anti-black violence. He is a self-hating Negro bootlick. He has as much contempt for black people as Patrick Lynch, Rudy Giuliani, or Kathy Hochul, or any other anti-black racist that you can name. I warned you that those bootlicking Negro preachers and so-called activists who you saw endorsing Adams were part of the problem, and that they were selling black New Yorkers up the river. Well, it's not some victimless crime when you make excuses for voting for anti-black bootlicks like Officer Adams. His entire job is to expedite the racial cleansing of black people out of New York City. He understands full well that that was the reason why white power was so eager to back him up. That's why they wanted him in office. That was the devil's bargain that he made. Talking all that crap about black on black crime, this guy was sitting here carrying every racist, white supremacist line against black people you could imagine. Meanwhile, the white supremacists are allowed to carry out their thuggery, and he doesn't even say boo. He knew what his role would be in killing black New Yorkers. The problem was there were a lot of black people who were in denial about it. Now, obviously, at this point, those black folks who voted for Adams are now going to try to pretend like they didn't. There's a lot of that going around, especially with Joe Biden. And in a lot of other cases, like with Al Sharpton, where their public support is a matter of public record, they'll instead try to talk around having supported Adams as if they never did it, as if they don't really know that he's mayor. But you better not be in denial about what's happening here. Black New Yorkers need to be aware that people like Adams are the stalking horses for white supremacy, and Kathy Hochul is nothing more than a slightly more wrinkled up version of Marjorie Taylor Greene. Trash like Hochul talk about making New York a safe haven for abortion and illegal aliens, but making it a free fire zone to kill black people in the streets. Will your black DNC chairman Hakeem Jeffries, who by the way is from New York by the way, will he ever publicly denounce Hochul for her remarks? Will he threaten to have her primaried when she tries to run for re-election in 2 years? Will he impose any sort of penalties or punishments for what she's done? As a New Yorker, a native New Yorker no less, will he say that she won't have his support when she runs for office? Of course not, because bootlicks don't disobey their masters. Black people in New York need to be aware of the threat. The answer to these ambush killings is to first of all be aware that there are a whole bunch of these thugs who are running around trying to find a black person who they can hopefully catch with their back turned. And you need to be ready to defend yourself from these ambushes. As black people, we have a right to be safe in our homes and in public and anywhere else, and to protect ourselves from anyone who tries to endanger us, like the thug who took the life of Mr. Neely. We also have a right to see anyone who calls themselves defending or justifying the killing of unarmed black people to be held accountable to our full satisfaction. There's no law that says that black people are obligated to sit on their hands and just wait until some violent thug decides to kill them. And even if there was such a law, which clearly Eric Adams and Kathy Hochul are attempting to enforce, black people are not obligated to obey it. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you, or in this case, chooses not to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Sabrina, Loke Thies, Charlie, Jacques Hargett, and Othniel Malcolm. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.